please take their seats. And the committee will come to order. Good morning. Today we welcome Ambassador Robert E. Lighthizer, the United States Trade Representative, to discuss U.S.-China trade. One of the challenges for the ambassador, members of the committee, and the administration indeed is the following: that as trade issues play out, there is generally some truth to what everybody says about trade. At the direction of the Trump administration, there are currently U.S. tariffs of $250 billion on Chinese imports. In retaliation, China has imposed tariffs on $110 billion of U.S. exports. This hearing is our opportunity to make clear what Congress stands for on U.S.-China trade and what the American people need to see in any trade agreement as the administration concludes its work in memorandums of understanding with China. At the outset, I want to acknowledge that Ambassador Lighthizer is leading negotiations with China and that he may want to exercise discretion about the level of detail he gets into as we reach the delicate stage of finishing, hopefully, the agreement. At the same time, I encourage the ambassador to be as forthcoming and vigorous as we know he is capable of doing as possible. I have often observed that there is truth, again, as I noted earlier, to what everybody says about China. China has been good for some, but it also has been bad for many others. In 2000, when Congress voted on normalizing trade relations with China, the promise was that China would reform and become market-based, democratic, and would respect human rights. But the China that we trade with and compete with today is very different from the one that we had hoped would emerge. China's economy, which has taken on some market characteristics, remains fundamentally state-directed. China's companies, state-owned or not, are called upon to serve the government's interests. China's trade and economic policies are coordinated through 5-year and 10-year plans. Those plans are backed by China's resources. They are aimed at fostering national champions, advancing China's economic and technological ambitions, and ensuring full employment in China. And they are implemented at the expense of other economies through the theft of others' intellectual property and without regard to the global trade rules or human rights of workers. These are structural economic challenges that American workers and companies face in trading and competing with China. While this administration confronts the same challenges with China that previous administrations have faced, it has chosen to use tactics and tools that previous administrations of both parties did not. The administration's tariffs have been sweeping, disruptive, controversial, and indeed, for some sectors, painful. The administration's promise is that high-risk approaches will yield high rewards. My concern is that we are about to see the administration use the same, from time to time, ineffective playbook that has been applied in the past. Recall that in April 2017, President Trump met with President Xi at Mar-a-Lago as part of a 100-day plan for a big China deal. The Commerce Secretary declared that outcomes from the exercise represented more than has been done in the whole history of U.S.-China relations. Of course, when we examined the results of these negotiations, we found that some of the commitments were not quite as advertised. Other commitments that were made promising changes in China were already in the process of being made. But in May of last year, China's trade negotiations seemed like it was about to lead to a package of large purchase commitments for commodities like soybeans, natural gas, along with aircraft. Those negotiations clearly were not leading to the solution that we had hoped for in terms of significant trade challenges. They indeed were put on hold. This time around, on December 1st, the President announced a 90-day period to fix our complex trade problems with China. And as we near the finish line, we are hearing once again about very large purchase commitments for commodities like soybeans, natural gas, and along with aircraft. There is a primary difference, however, with these negotiations. That is that Ambassador Lighthizer is at the helm. He has time and again, I think, developed a vision that many of us on this committee will support vigorously, and we believe that the structural problems that faces America as it bases its trade relationship with China are well observed by the ambassador. This administration has chosen to take a path of high-risk confrontation. It must hold out for the good deal, a structural deal. The future of America's economic prosperity is in the balance. And with that, I would like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Brady, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Neal, for convening this hearing on America's trade relationship with China. And thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, for your leadership in the ongoing negotiations with China and for consulting with us today about where those negotiations stand and what comes next. We can all strongly agree that China has cheated on trade for decades, severely harming American workers and businesses. President Trump deserves significant credit for being the first president to confront China's unfair and predatory trade practices head-on and insist on a new, fair trading relationship with the U.S. While we want China to buy more U.S. goods that support farmers, manufacturers, and professionals here at home, it's even more important for us to hold China accountable to meeting high international standards on intellectual property rights, on subsidization, overcapacity, and the other structural ways in which China distorts the global economy. A new era of fair trade between China and the U.S. is in everyone's interest. The solution must be enforceable at every level of Chinese governance, measurable, and subject to corrective action should it fall short of commitments. And it should provide as much predictability as possible for our American job creators seeking to serve China's market. With a more level playing field and now armed with a competitive 21st century tax code, I'm confident that our farmers, workers, and local businesses can compete and win anywhere in the world. U.S. companies face a wide range of trade barriers from China, and I look forward to a thoughtful discussion of them today. China's unfair treatment of U.S. investors is a huge part of the problem that U.S. Trade Representative Section 301 report identifies in great detail. For example, China's equity caps and joint venture requirements prevent U.S. companies from controlling their own operations as well as their own intellectual property when they invest in China, giving Chinese competitors an unfair advantage and costing American jobs. A high standard, fully enforceable bilateral investment treaty with China can help us address many of these issues for the long term. And I'm hopeful the substantive talks underway, including in Washington last week, will produce meaningful commitments from China to lower trade barriers, achieve structural reforms, and establish a new era of fair trade. But no one country can take on China entirely alone. The three-party initiative, Mr. Ambassador, that you are undertaking with the European Union and Japan holds great promise that we must build on together. I'm also encouraged the Trump administration is showing leadership in aggressively challenging China when it violates WTO rules, including in its intellectual property licensing policies, as well as its subsidies and tariff rate quotas for our key ag commodities. At the same time, I am concerned about the very real impact of tariffs on American manufacturers, consumers, and farmers. I'll continue to work closely with the President and his team to ensure we minimize impact to the United States and our allies as we take on China. Fairly traded goods should be excluded from our tariff actions, as should products that are otherwise unavailable to U.S. companies. And I think having a real and workable exclusion process in place for any tariffs is essential so that we can focus these impacts on the bad behavior of China. In sum, thank you for being here, Ambassador. I look forward to today's discussion about the challenges we face in China and our demand for China to negotiate in good faith to achieve a durable and enforceable solution to the structural issues we face. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. And without objection, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. Today's sole witness is Ambassador Robert E. Lighthizer, the United States Trade Representative. The committee has received your written statement that will be made part of the formal hearing record. You have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Ambassador Lighthizer, again, welcome, and you may begin your testimony as you are ready.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Brady, and distinguished members of the committee, it is a pleasure to be here today and to discuss this very important issue. I should say at the beginning, I can never hear anybody up there, so at some point we'll have to get to
Ambassador, could you speak into the microphone?
Yeah, so you can't hear me and I can't hear you. This is like a perfect room. I want those 10 seconds back. I have to say that every time I come here. All right. I think at the beginning it is appropriate to take a minute and remind ourselves that with all our pressing problems, we have a very successful economy. Under President Trump's leadership, we are growing much faster than any G7 nation. We have created millions of new jobs, significantly to me, 500,000 manufacturing jobs. And we have seen 2 million people join the workforce. These are people who were not in it before. These are real working people moving from despair to hope, and their kids from insecurity to a future. A lot needs to be done, and I salute all members of both parties who are working so diligently on issues of worker training, opiate addiction, as well as trade and other issues. But we are here to talk about China. I agree with those who see our large and growing trade deficit and their unfair trade practices, including technology transfer issues, failure to protect intellectual property, large subsidies, cyber theft of commercial secrets, and other problems as major threats to our economy. We can compete with anyone in the world, but we must have rules, enforced rules, that make sure market outcomes, not state capitalism and technology theft, determine winners. President Trump has for years recognized this very serious and I would say existential problem, and he is determined to take action to defend our workers, farmers, and ranchers, and our economic system. He directed me to conduct a study under Section 301. After months of hard work, the President ordered that certain tariffs be put in place. Because of his insight and grit, we are in a position to deal with this problem for the first time after decades of governmental inaction. I would like to note that as with many extremely important issues facing our country, prescience has been bipartisan. The Speaker was an early, forceful, and foresighted leader on this issue. I have admired her perception and hard work over the years and have counseled with her regularly in my current position. I would just like to read something briefly. Faced with the PNTR vote in April of 2000, the Speaker said, "It is incumbent upon all of us in the public and private sectors to work for free and open trade with China that is real. The U.S.-China bilateral WTO agreement, however, is seriously deficient in substance, implementation, and enforcement. This issue is too important for our economy to be based on a pattern of broken promises, not proven performance. China can become a member of the WTO without Congress having to surrender its right to U.S.-China trade review annually. There is no reason why we should permanently surrender that leverage at this time." I ask, if her position had prevailed, how different would things be right now? There are many other examples of bipartisan leadership, including a lot of people on this committee, and I'm going to get into them and answer the questions if it's relevant. Let me close by saying that we have engaged in a very intense, extremely serious, and very specific negotiation with China on crucial structural issues for several months now. We are making real progress. If we can complete this effort, and again I say if, and can reach a satisfactory solution to the all-important outstanding issue of enforceability, as well as some other concerns, we might be able to have an agreement that helps us turn the corner in our economic relationship with China. Let me be clear, much still needs to be done, both before an agreement is reached and, more importantly, after it is reached, if one is reached. I want to thank all members for your bipartisan approach on this seminal effort, and I look forward to continuing our work together. I want to say that if this was not a bipartisan view, we would not be having the success that we're having. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We will now move to questioning. Without objection, members will have 4 minutes to question the witness today in order to ensure that all members have an opportunity to inquire before the ambassador's schedule requires him to depart. I will begin by recognizing myself. Members will be acknowledged in the order of what we call the Gibbons rule, and that is when the member took their seat. Mr. Ambassador, In my opening, I referenced some of the earlier administration efforts to negotiate trade with China. Those efforts seem to overlook the deep and complex structural problems underlying our trade relationship. My question is this: what will be different this time, and what can we expect next?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that's the fundamental question. What the President wants is an agreement that, number one, is enforceable, but that changes the pattern of practice of forced technology transfer, intellectual property protection, large industrial policy subsidies, and then a whole variety of specific impediments to trade and unfair practices in the area of agriculture, in the area of services. What we want is fair trade that requires structural change, and it has to be enforceable. We have had, and I can go through for the members, many, many examples of the Chinese agreeing to specific, not this specific, but agreeing to take steps to forego certain unfair trade practices, and in very few cases have they actually kept their obligations. We have to, in this case, approach this with the view that there are reformers in China who want to change these practices, and we're working together with them. That has to be our approach. And if that's the case, our hope is to have specific language on specific issues that is enforceable through a very clear process.
So do you envision one negotiated package in the next few weeks that's going to resolve all of these structural issues?
So I'm not foolish enough to think that there's going to be one negotiation that's going to change all of the practices of China or our relationship with them. I don't believe that. I think that we have to take on the major issues, the ones that I just raised, and we have to specifically preclude anti-market practices and practices that are unfair to our workers and ranchers and farmers, and there are lots of them. At the end of this negotiation, if we're successful, there'll be a signing, and then there's going to be a long process of me working with the members of this committee and the Finance Committee in the Senate and other members to assure that we actually live up to this. And I believe other problems will arise, and they're going to have to be dealt with. I view this as a process, but this is I use the term turning the corner. This is the first time, I believe, that it's been approached in this way. And it's really the result of the creation of an enormous amount of leverage by the President.
Mr. Ambassador, as you reach an accord, will you envision putting the tariff threat in abeyance?
So this may not be the first time or the last time I say this in this hearing, but actually specific provisions may be. I want to kind of hold off. As the Chairman knows well, I'm happy to talk to him about whatever's on my mind. I love it when you said there had to be some discretion here. I wrote that down because I'm thinking that's like not my strongest suit, discretion. But I'm trying to do it. I will talk to you about that specifically. Certainly it is an objective of the Chinese that tariffs go away. And I should just add a footnote. That, in my judgment, does not mean anti-dumping, countervailing duty, the normal trade law. That's a separate process. That's a separate enforcement process. I'm dealing with Section 301 in this agreement.
Thank you. Let me recognize Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think you raise, both you and Ambassador Lighthizer raised an important part here, which is this is the first serious substantive attempt to change China's misbehavior. And it's not just one issue, that you are taking a comprehensive approach by challenging China at the World Trade Organization in cases, aligning with Europe and Japan on the WTO reforms that can address this, implementing the investment restrictions Congress put in place last year to address China, and then the 301 section case, the issue you're dealing with right now. It will take, this is the first comprehensive approach I've seen, and the one I think holds the most likelihood for success. I think as people look at what is a successful win for America, you ought to really focus, as you just mentioned, on the Section 301 area, where you really pulled back the curtain on China's trade practices and predatory trade practices and laid out that case. I know at home in Texas we have one of our best corporate citizens, Huntsman Corporation, nearly 1,000 employees in my district. They're an example of how American companies have no recourse when their intellectual property rights are violated in China, because provincial Chinese courts simply don't uphold the rule of law. Not only did the court throw out this patent intellectual property case based on the expiration date of the die, they appointed a court panel to review the case that had an employee of the company that stole the intellectual property. It is that hard for businesses to compete. So let's talk about 301 a second. I think these are the key issues here. That'll define, I think, our success. You mentioned this earlier. Will the agreement that you're negotiating with China have measurable commitments in them? Will they be enforceable at all levels of China's governance? Because we know the play they've run before is to, pretend to protect intellectual property at the central government level, but not at the provincial or local court and communities levels. And finally, will there be an avenue for corrective action if China doesn't live up to its commitments in what we hope will be an agreement here in the near future? So measurable, enforceable at all levels of governance, and corrective action to make sure they live by those commitments.
So, thank you, Mr. Brady. I appreciate that. First of all, in terms of what is successful, I've been doing this a long time, but nonetheless, over the course of the last few months, I went to every statement that business groups have made, that agriculture groups have made, that labor unions have made, that members have made, most of them myself, in some cases having my immediate staff go through and tell me what that guy or that woman said is essential to a successful conclusion. And that is my guide. I'm taking that and I'm distilling that down. And some of you it's one thing, some of you it's another, but it's all right in a band, right? And so that's what I am measuring myself by, and that's what I have as my objective. It's not just what I think; it's what everybody. I've distilled down what the people who have spent time thinking about this think. So the Huntsman example is, like, unfortunately one of many, many thousands.
Unfortunately.
And I could go on and on about that. I won't, because I only have 12 seconds or 10 seconds to go. So number one, yes, clearly it has to be specific, measurable. It has to be enforceable at all levels of government. Some things are not appropriate for that, but 99%, the core stuff is all. And in the agreement, it will say central, subcentral, local, and controlled agencies. So it's got to be across the board like that. And we have to have the ability to take proportional action unilaterally to make sure that we have a situation where they're following the contract.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. The chair would now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Lewis, to inquire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and ranking member, for holding this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here. I've said it before, and I will say it again. There's no way to compete in a race to the bottom. Like our friend and colleague, Ms. Sewell, I grew up in Alabama. She grew up in the big city, but I grew up in rural Alabama. And I watched American jobs disappear throughout my life and career. In my home state of Georgia, many manufacturers, workers continue to struggle and find good, livable wage jobs. Over the years, many of those businesses move overseas in search of cheap labor and lower environmental protection. What I witnessed in our community inspired me to oppose granting China permanent normal trade relationship almost 20 years ago. At the same time, my congressional district is also home to a large number of manufacturers, both large and small, who rely on aluminum. I do not need to tell you, Mr. Ambassador, that China plays by its own rules and focuses on the long game. While we may differ on the tactics, everyone in this room will agree that we need a level playing field, and we don't have it. We can do better. We can do much better. As you know, Mr. Ambassador, this is not an easy matter. We must be thoughtful, we must be mindful, and we must get it right. Now, Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you again for being here, and thank you for your service. The current negotiation focus on a number of issues. I want to know whether labor and environment protection are on and part of the discussion.
So I would say, first of all, the principal reason why I'm spending my time doing this now is for the same reason that you just stated. That is to say, we have lost, not all just to China, but since China joined the WTO, we've lost 5 million manufacturing jobs and millions of additional jobs. And that it would distress me if that was the result of economic forces. But it's not the result of economic forces. It's the result of state capitalism. So I am motivated by the same thing that you are, and I want to be judged by that, right? I want to ultimately be judged by that. On the aluminum question, you're completely right. We have a problem, a global problem in aluminum, precisely because China doesn't operate on an economic system. They have created, through controlling their market access and subsidies and other practices, an extraordinary amount of excess capacity that has basically wiped out the aluminum industry across the world. The issues that we are focusing on in this negotiation are not, I mean, they are labor and environment to the extent those are unfair trade practices. But it's not the same as we are, as you know well, in USMCA, where those are specific objectives that we are requiring change in. So, to the extent there are unfair trade practices, I'd say also we are constrained by the limits of 301 and by the statute that we have to work with. But those are also, as you know well, high priorities for me.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Nunes is
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
recognized.
Thank you. Ambassador, thanks for being here, and I want to congratulate you for really being part of the first administration in 20 years of complaining about China to actually do something. I associate myself with a lot of the comments that Mr. Lewis made, and I know it's tough because I know the Chinese are trying to be very targeted in how the tariffs are being implemented on our side. But I can tell you that from the intelligence angle that we've been studying here in the Congress for several years, the Chinese have moved into taking over the communication systems around the world. They've moved into building strategic military locations around the globe, and those are spreading. And at the same time, they've targeted major industries for either takeover through acquisition of banks, energy sectors, and others around the globe in every continent, including here in the United States. So I'd like to give you an opportunity, Ambassador, to get into a little bit of how the Chinese use the regulatory angle to encourage abuse and theft of intellectual property. Because it's not something that I think a lot of Americans understand, but they are actively, on a daily basis stealing intellectual property from right here in the United States and transferring that to China to compete directly with our companies and our allies' companies around the globe. I'll give you an opportunity to expand on that.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Congressman. So, number one, I think that the U.S. has the best technology in the world. It's probably our single biggest competitive advantage. and why we'll be #1 for a long time if we protect our intellectual property. Because it's not just a question of high-tech industries. It's steel. It's these combines. If you get into a modern combine, it's like a spaceship was in the '60s, right? These how they drive these things. They have all these computer operations and satellite operations. So technology is our biggest advantage, and it runs absolutely across every part of our economy. It is the key, and that's why the President had me focus on it right here. And I think China, as you suggest, knows full well that it's the key. Technology is what's going to determine who rules the future. Chinese practices are, you could break them down into twofold. One is what they do there, and the other is what they do here. We are negotiating provisions that will, if enforced, restate, make far more specific, and clarify commitments against cyber theft, against physical theft, and against using investment practices to get technology. What happens now, I don't want to go through a lot of specific examples, and I know you know far more of them than I do because this is part of your responsibility in the Intelligence Committee. But what happens very often is China comes in. For example, they invest in a company. The company develops technology. That technology ends up in China. And it could end up through investment. It could end up through cyber theft. It could end up through employees working for that company and then leaving and going to China. I mean, there's a whole group of things. And what we're trying to do is deal with that as much as we can in one agreement. And then that's one side of the problem. It's the one you're focused on. The whole other side is how they get technology from us through non-economic means in China. U.S. companies operating there, and that's another thing that we're trying to deal with in this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think our country is fortunate that you're on the front lines of this very important negotiation. I did note with interest the exchange you had with the President last Friday that this ongoing negotiation with China is a trade agreement. That's the goal, and not a memorandum of understanding. And I think you indicated that since he's the boss, you agree with him and that your goal is to negotiate and complete a reasonable trade agreement. Is that right?
I'm going to elaborate on that when it's my turn to talk.
Well, I'm just referring to your precise words last Friday that you would no longer use the term memorandum of understanding and that this is a trade agreement. Pardon? I think if you turn your microphone up.
We're having trouble hearing you, Mr. Ambassador.
Yeah, and could you pause my time here?
No.
Is that better now?
Yes.
Yes.
Ah,
Thank you.
See how easy that is. I actually felt pretty good when you couldn't hear me either for a minute. I felt like there's finally a fair system here. There will be, I'm not quite sure I know, Congressman Doggett, where you're going on this, but this will be a binding agreement. I should take a step back and say to the extent any agreement between nations is binding, right? I always have to make that clear. There's a great de Gaulle quote, which is that agreements between nations, I'll slightly change it to update it to the current situation, agreements between nations like flowers and children last while they last.
Right. And it's a binding trade agreement, a contract, as the President referred to it. And as a binding trade agreement, given the statutory authority that you and the President have to negotiate that's delegated by Congress, can you outline to us what you would anticipate after the agreement would be the timetable for submitting it to Congress for approval?
Thank you. We have no intentions of submitting it to Congress.
Well, if it's a trade agreement under Section 103, you're required to submit it to Congress, are you not?
It's an executive agreement. We're not required to submit it to Congress. We'll have to have this debate at some point. The President has, I'm sorry, Congressman.
As you've agreed with the President, it is a binding trade agreement that you're seeking. You can seek it only through delegation of congressional authority, and you're required to submit such agreements back if you're lowering U.S. tariffs, which would appear to be the case.
Well, let me just say that we are no way. This is a settlement of a 301 action. It's the President is using his power under Section 301, which has been delegated, and it's an executive agreement which the Constitution gives the President the right to enter into. We're not changing any tariff lines. We're not using TPA, and if we did, by the way, I wouldn't be here now anyway because we wouldn't have gone through the process. So this is not a TPP process. This is a settlement of a 301 action, and it's the President's constitutional authority to enter into executive agreements.
Since we may not agree on that, let me ask you if you do agree that unless you get meaningful structural changes to address the stealing of our intellectual property and the other issues that are out there structurally that you outline in your testimony, if all we get is the sale of a few more soybeans and other products, then this is an agreement not worth having, isn't it?
Yeah, I couldn't hear the last caveat.
I'm just saying the goal here is meaningful structural changes, and if we don't get them, this is an agreement not worth having.
I agree completely with that statement, and right now we're 500.
And let me just add how important it is, given, and I realize this is not in your direct jurisdiction, but I agree with my Texas Senator John Cornyn and the others who expressed concern about Huawei and its national security threat. And if there's any bargaining away of our national security to get this agreement, it would be with great harm to our country. Thank you.
So let me just say, one, I agree with you on 50% of the things. And that's you get to the Hall of Fame if
that's
you do
progress.
That. Yeah, well, no, we're usually at 90%. But I do not think it should just be a purchase agreement. I agree with that completely. And that law enforcement provisions are outside of my purview. I have nothing to do with them.
Thank you. The chair would recognize Mr. Buchanan to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing. I also want to thank the ambassador for reaching out really to both sides. I know you've had a lot of meetings. You've got a lot more meetings you're going to do, so I appreciate you doing that on a bipartisan basis. I also want to just echo what many of my colleagues have said in terms of enforcement. My experience, I happened to be in Beijing 20 years ago as a part of the U.S. Chamber and a delegation there. Intellectual properties was a big issue back 20 years ago in terms of the theft. And I'm not sure how far, there hasn't been any or much progress on that. It's still, as you know, a big challenge. And the thought is, whether the agreement's 150 pages or 1,000 pages, what I've learned in my business career, the agreement's only as good as the two parties involved. So I just want to go on record also concerned about the enforcement. I'm for free trade, but it's got to be fair, and we got to level the playing field. I want to switch gears to, I touched base with you the other day, but it's a big issue in Florida, I think across the country, fentanyl. Last year, 77% increase in deaths in Florida. China's one of the leading sources for fentanyl. I know the President has had some discussions, and I think he said he had some commitments. Can you maybe expound on where that's at in terms of fentanyl and the Chinese ability to produce that, and what we're trying to do as a part of this document, ideally?
Yeah, well, thank you, Congressman. First of all, you're right, there's a long history of failure by China to protect intellectual property. The first kind of modern example of it was a 301 that was brought in 1991 during the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, and then between 2010 to 2016, there were 10 different commitments where they agreed to do certain things, which commitments I would suggest were not lived up to, and therefore enforcement really is the biggest sort of thing. The President completely agrees with you on the issue of fentanyl. He specifically raised it with President Xi when we were in Buenos Aires at the dinner. President Xi, once again, I don't want to suggest that this is my area of expertise because it isn't, but agreed that he would treat it as whatever the equivalent of a controlled substance is in China. And this is something that the President views himself as having a commitment on. It may very well be something that we end up writing into this agreement, but it clearly is something the President views himself as having a commitment on, and that we are monitoring to see if there, in fact, are changes. Very important to the country for all the reasons that you said. I even made a veiled allusion to it in my opening statement. This idea of fighting opioids is as important as job training.
Let me add one other thing I just want to put on your radar. I know you've got a lot of things on your radar, but the ag community in Florida, forestry, a couple of years ago it did $8.4 billion. It's a big industry in our state. And in terms of exports to China, that's dried up for various reasons. We can talk about that at a later date. I just want to make sure that's something you're considering or looking at as well as part of the agreement.
No, I am. I actually have a list of specific issues that have been raised by members that are appropriate for the agreement, and it's something that we have raised and will continue to raise.
Thank you, and I yield back.
We recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing. Ambassador, thank you for being here. And thank you for your willingness to work with us and meet with us. You've been very open and very helpful during your time in this spot. I have 3 issues. You've heard from me on a couple of them before. I'd just like to reiterate those and raise one new one to you. And then let you respond accordingly. As you know, my district produces the finest wine in the world, and China is the largest and the fastest growing wine marketplace in the world. The 232 and 301 tariffs put a 39% tariff on our product. And we're having to compete with other New World wine areas, Australia and Chile, with 0 tariff. So I'd like some assurance that you're doing everything you can to ensure that high value-added specialty crop products have the enhanced entrance or enhanced access to the market. I know you're working on all agricultural issues and products. And then the other ag issue is rice. You know, milled rice in California has been waiting for the promised access to the Chinese market ever since China joined the WTO. And they've been very, very helpful, as you know, and very understanding. I guess I'd like to have some idea as to how much longer they're going to have to wait, or whether or not we're close to the promised access. And then the new issue that I want to raise today is the tariffs on building and construction materials. The national home builders suggest that these tariffs equal about $1 billion worth of tax on residential construction. And as you know, affordable housing, the lack of affordable housing is something that impacts all of our districts, every district in the country. And this just makes it harder to be able to build homes and get people into homes. And in my district in particular, we just went through a just terrific, horrific fire where we lost about 7,000 homes. And homeowners are trying to rebuild, and they've seen the cost of building materials coupled with the shortage of supply and the shortage of labor just drive the cost of replacement to a point where they can't rebuild the home that they lost in their fire. And then there's 7,000 homes in my district, and then the new fires up in the northern part of the state and in Congressman LaMalfa's area, and down in the southern part of the state, there's thousands more. And this is really a setback for homeowners who've already been through a lot. And so I'm just wondering, is that $1 billion tax really the best way to hold China accountable? And I concur that, you know, we need to hold them accountable, but is this the best way to do it at the expense of people who are trying to rebuild and move into their homes?
So thank you, Congressman. I would say, first of all, on the wine issue, and as you call them, high value added specialty crops, yes, they're very important. This negotiation, as we have all said, is about structural change and enforcement. But it is important that we have purchases, because the purchases will be good for specific people, and it'll also get the deficit down, which I think is an important thing to do directionally for sure. And in that context, we very much talk about high value added specialty crops, and wine, of course, is a great example of one. I mean, it is a product where the United States makes the best products in the world. So that I can attest to that personally. The second thing is rice is complicated, all right. First of all, we are talking about rice in the context of the purchases, number one. Number two, as you know, we have WTO cases, which we have. Is the second one public yet? No? Well, we have one that we've won and one that is in the process. It'll become public at some point. So trying to resolve those in the context of this agreement is something that we are trying to do. So that is something that we have raised. But as you know, rice is a funny issue in China. It's not. It has a different a political context than a lot of these other things we're talking about. But nonetheless, we're trying to do that. In terms of the $1 billion, I don't know the letter. I should look at it. I presume they're talking about softwood lumber, which I would say is a litigation matter, an AD/CVD matter, and I presume also steel and aluminum. I presume those are the things they're talking about. Yeah, I would assume that, and each of them has their own context. I would say softwood lumber is a litigation thing that we have to work our way through. Steel and aluminum, my objective, as many members know, is to try to work out something with Mexico and Canada on those things. We've
run out of time, but thank you. Any information you can get back to me.
All right, I'm sorry.
That. Thank you.
Now that we've established that California produces the best wine in the world, the chair would recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, to inquire.
I want to say Oregon, and there are some other states that also have very good wine. I want to recognize. Maybe Georgia. I don't know.
And the Nebraska wine industry is coming right along as well. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us this morning. I appreciate that certainly you're dealing with a lot of issues, and we appreciate that you take the time to be here this morning. President Trump has time and again expressed his concerns for our farmers and ranchers. He has certainly made the National Farm Bureau Federation annual conference and annual event on his schedule. He's been steadfast in his insistence that agriculture be a part of any negotiations we undertake with the European Union. For this and much more, the rural community is appreciative. There are many long-term issues to be considered in the China negotiations, including intellectual property issues, barriers to biotech products, and many other non-tariff trade barriers. However, I do want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that commodity prices are down and the breadbasket of the world, being America, has been negatively impacted by the cumulative impacts of the tariffs and certainly non-tariff trade barriers as well. We should never lose sight of this fact in our deliberations. Because it is so crucial and these talks come to a successful conclusion, I'm grateful for the President's personal involvement. I, along with many members of this committee, asked last summer that the President engage directly with President Xi to move these talks forward. I urge him to continue to do so and that you remember the sacrifices being made by our producers, ag producers, in your daily discussions. In addition to China, we need to continue to move forward with USMCA. We need to bring down the 232 tariffs on Canada and Mexico and eliminate the retaliation our producers continue to endure in order to facilitate the agreement's approval. I'm grateful for the progress made in the Japan talks. Every day our producers face tariff rates higher than their competitors. When doing business in Japan is a lost opportunity to expand and defend their market share. So once again, time is of the essence. With the President's commitment to U.S. agriculture in mind, I would appreciate your thoughts on the 232 tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and also your outlook for the Japan negotiations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Congressman. First of all, in the context of China, it's not just about purchases. We had many, many hours of discussion about a whole variety of issues, of which I won't go through because most members would have at least some interest, from biotechnology to specific issues involving beef, poultry, aquatics, meats. I mean, it's just, I could go through it all. A lot on rice. I mean, beyond the purchase, a lot on just the SPS issues. So we spent a lot of time on there. We actually had long discussions on ractopamine, for those of you who are from the beef-producing areas, with the Vice Premier of China. So it was pretty detailed discussion. So having said that, to sort of jump ahead, I want to go to Japan very soon. The date's probably going to be in the next month. I want to have a trilateral meeting there on this issue of China with these, and I also want to start our negotiations, which we've now, remember, we've gone through the process of TPA with everyone. with the Congress, and now we're beyond our 90 days, so we can start the actual negotiating. We feel a certain urgency, a real urgency, because of the combination of market access from TPP in Europe in this sort of thing you alluded to, and it's going to have a real effect on our farmers. So it's something that we feel very strongly about. On Canada and Mexico, in the context of maintaining the integrity of the steel and aluminum program, we want very much to work out an agreement with Canada and Mexico, and we're in the process of doing that. Whether we'll succeed or not, I don't know, but it certainly is my hope that we'll do that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for your candor over the last several days. My question, and I hope to give you as much time as we can to answer, is we all, I think you can sense up here, the bipartisan nature of our concern as it relates to China. And so my question would be pretty straightforward. How will you define success in our meeting from China, and with a specific focus from the standpoint of a number of us here on both labor standards and environmental standards, and how will that play into whether or not you feel the pending negotiations will be successful?
Thank you, Congressman. I would say what we are doing and what we have to remind ourselves in this context is settling a 301 case. So how I would define success, and once again, I'll try to repeat what I said before, I really went through and tried to distill what everyone else, members, business groups, farm groups, but also experts, people who actually study these things. And for me, success is number one, enforceable. Number two, real rules on forced technology transfer at every level of government, as Mr. Brady said, which is absolutely essential. Minimum intellectual property requirements. And once again, this section is probably going to be, if we have an agreement, the IP section alone will be about 27 or 28 pages. It's going to be, this is long, detailed, but every one of you would say, oh yes, that's what I would expect normal IP protection to be, right? In other words, I'm not inventing anything at all. We have a series of items involving services. There are specific provisions that China has that keep us out of banking, out of electronic payment, out of a whole variety of things like that. And we, on many of those, we've made substantial progress, and I would consider that to be. Another chapter, I would say, will be non-tariff barriers, and this is literally how we negotiated this thing. Non-tariff barriers. What's a big non-tariff barrier? That is these subsidies, these industrial subsidies that have the effect, which have the effect of making it possible for our people not only to compete in many cases in China, but to compete around the world. So that's another thing. There's a whole lot of things that we expect to gather on agriculture, and I kind of went through it on that, and we have made progress on a number of those. One thing that we haven't mentioned is we are negotiating currency restraints. A lot of members are very concerned about currency manipulation and having access to the information that allows you to make a combination. So that is another part of these negotiations. And to be honest, there actually are more, and I could make it even more detailed. But to me, that's how I am going to determine whether or not this is a trade agreement. Now, keep in mind, it's not like an FTA in the sense that we're going in there and going across the board. What we're going in there is focusing on what was raised by, for the most part, what was raised by our 301. And if we do all of those things, and the Speaker said this, and it's not enforceable, and she said it in the context of USMCA, and it's not enforceable, then it's not very valuable. So we have to have it be enforceable, and that I think it will be for the first time. I think we will have an enforceable agreement.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Marchant, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Lighthizer, thanks for being here today. I don't know if you're familiar with the district that I represent, but when you land at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, you're in the middle of my district. It's the headquarters. The national headquarters for Toyota, ExxonMobil, Fleur, Kimberly-Clark, et cetera. So I have a district that the businesses and major employers in my district are very vitally interested in what you are doing, and deeply appreciate your hard work on behalf of the country. DFW Airport is basically facilitates $35 billion worth of trade. The ranking member, Mr. Brady, has an airport of similar stature in his district. So to us in Texas, our ports are not only Houston, but our ports are the airports. And because of that, trade is very vitally important in my district. I have a letter here from our governor, Greg Abbott, that is a full-throated support of your negotiations, and I would like to put that in the record, Mr. Chairman, in that it is a support of your work on the USMCA, and he recognizes the importance of that, and we would like to make sure that this goes in the record and make sure that that you know that he is in full support of the work that you're doing. Because I have such a interest in my district, when I go to town hall meetings, what am I going to be able to tell my constituents that is being accomplished in the China agreements and the China discussions that will be very important that gets changed for my district?
So thank you, Congressman. First of all, I've spent a lot of time at DFW, and if that entire airport is in your district, you've got a very large district, because I think that airport is bigger than some districts in the members have. It's the biggest thing I've ever seen. So, and I appreciate very much the governor's support and hopefully your support for USMCA. If USMCA doesn't pass, I've said this before, it would be a catastrophe across the country, but it would particularly be a catastrophe in Texas. It's just, I mean, it would be very bad on every level, way beyond economics, right? I mean, you know what I'm talking about, and I won't dwell on that, but I'm very appreciative of and the president's very appreciative of the governors. So when I look at this, and this is not just your district, I don't know if you have, you must have a big district if it's got that airport in it, but if you have any agricultural products, there will be a substantial increase in those and a substantial reduction in barriers. But I would say, when I talk to members generally, the most important single thing that we're going to do is stop the non-economic transfer of technology. That technology really is what separates us from the rest of the world. And it is, for me, and I think this is true in most, it is for me what's going to ensure that our kids have the kind of jobs that we had and better jobs that we want them to have. If we end up losing that technological edge where we are number 2 in technology, then the world's going to look very different for our children. And that literally is what I think is happening. I could talk about the various specific provisions, but if we make headway to stop this transfer of technology and this unfair trade by this trading partner, it's going to have a huge impact in terms of jobs and high-end jobs in America.
Thank you for the work you're doing, Ambassador.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the Trade Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Blumenauer, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, I think you've got one of the toughest jobs in the administration, and we appreciate your being here. We appreciate your openness and candor and discussions you've had with me and so many members of the committee on both sides of the aisle. Frankly, I'm a little concerned about the 301 tariffs as kind of a blunt instrument, a tax on everyday Americans and most businesses. And I am concerned that we have some sort of agreement that results just in purchasing soybeans and airplanes. That's not sustainable. I'm hopeful that this effort that you've been involved with in using the tariffs and the negotiations results in some structural changes in order to be termed a success. And I'm confident that is your goal as well. Any meaningful deal, I feel, must effectively deal with another long-term problem that has been vexing us for the last couple decades, currency manipulation. The President made a campaign promise that he would have the Treasury Secretary label China a currency manipulator on day one of his presidency. Well, I'm not so much concerned about that broken promise as I am whether or not we're moving forward. It doesn't appear as though China has been actually manipulating in the last 25 months. I'm concerned whether the administration is focusing on ensuring China commits to transparency regarding its currency practices, addressing potential that China will resume aggressive currency manipulation damaging our economy. In the past, you've testified before this committee regarding the detrimental impact of Chinese currency manipulation on our economy and manufacturing in particular. You've even called for the United States to change our trade remedy laws and bring a WTO case against it. I have 4 questions. It's been claimed that there is already a deal reached on currency. Is that true? If so, can you tell us anything about the substance of that agreement? In the past, I've made a point in my support for trade agreements that we need to have our trading partners commit to stronger worker protections, environmental standards, currency disciplines, and that the commitments to be meaningful. Are you seeking enforceable currency commitments from China? And last but not least, if you see indications that China is manipulating, what will the United States to do? Does enforcement mean more across-the-board tariffs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I would say, as you say, currency problems is something that I've spent a fair amount of my time, not necessarily in my current job, but in previous jobs, worrying about. And I would also say that it's not just a problem with China. It's a problem with a lot of other areas in Asia, and a reasonable case can be made that it has at times been a serious problem with Japan, and I know those of you who are in the automobile industry realize that. It was a substantial problem, and we lost a lot of jobs because of that, but also some other areas. I don't want to name any other countries, but it has been a problem from time to time, so it's something we have to focus on. There are costs in being the reserve currency, but one of them can't be that we lose, that the good people who go to work every day and have a competitive job lose their jobs. So it's something we have to focus on. In here, is there agreement? There's no agreement on anything until there's agreement on everything. You know that from how these things work. But the reality is that we have spent a lot of time on currency, and it'll be enforceable. The agreement will be enforceable, and I think there'll be something on it. But I'll talk to you offline.
Yeah, I would appreciate that.
Chair would recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Wolarski, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I ask permission to insert into the record a letter signed by over 150 trade associations asking for a Federal Register notice that formally delays the increase of the List 3 tariffs from 10% to 25%.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, great to see you again. Always glad to have you here. When can we expect that Federal Register notice?
So the Federal, that Federal Register notice is being worked on right now. The President's made the decision, and it's sort of in process. In the next day or so, the President has made that decision. He's made the announcement, and we're following the legal process. We have a process where we go through. We have a TPSC process, as you know. We deal with other agencies, and there are certain steps that we have to go to. But that is something that will happen, and it'll happen according to the normal course.
And with that, when do you anticipate releasing more decisions for exclusion requests from List 1 or 2 of the 301 tariffs?
So we're in the process of doing that right now. And those were, in the first place, we've already granted more than 1,000 or almost 1,000, as you know. and things were sort of slowed down because of the government closure. But we're in the process of doing that right now. We expect another sort of tranche to come out fairly soon.
Mr. Chairman, I ask permission to insert into the record a letter myself and my friend Mr. Kine led that was signed by 167 of our colleagues asking for an exclusion process for List 3 of the 301 tariffs. Mr. Chairman?
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, there's obviously great support in Congress for an exclusion process for List 3, and we've chatted about it, and I appreciate that. In fact, the most recent spending bill instructed USTR to establish a process within 30 days. We're almost halfway to that deadline. Do you expect to meet that 30-day deadline? Oh, Mr. Chairman, I can't hear you.
Can you get that
Mr.
microphone,
Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador?
Thank you.
I would say, first of all, that was a report from the Appropriations Committee. I understand that there are people in Congress who want us to have an exclusion process. It's something that we're looking at. Our view till now has been that we would have an exclusion process for the $50 billion, which was at 25%, the 10%, which is what you're referring to in this case, that there would not be an exclusion process. I would note that since the date that we put that into place, there's been a 7 or an 8, depending on when you stop, devaluation of the Chinese currency. So the effect has been less significant than fully 10% on those people are affected. And our hope is that we can deal with this in the context of our negotiations with the Chinese. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just, I also appreciate, I know you and I chatted, the constraints on resources, and I understand that you're facing with this exclusion process. I recognize that the process for Lists 1 and 2 is tough to administer, and I know it's moving slowly, and that List 3 is kind of looming out there at 4 times the size, and I understand that as well. But can I just ask you this, and to close here, is there a way to simplify things a little to take the load off of your agency? For instance, what about companies who are hurt because their only competitors are foreign and are able to export finished products to the U.S. at little or no tariffs?
Well, we have a process right now that we're following that we think is fair, and it looks at the competitive effect, whether products are available in other areas, and whether or not it's the focus of China 2025. So we're happy with our current process, but it's as you say, it's a big process.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Kine, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your testimony today, for the outreach that you've been making so far this year. I'm going to ask you to respond to a couple of questions in a moment, Mr. Ambassador, one of which is the level of cooperation or coordination you have with other nations in regards to what you're trying to accomplish as it relates to China. And the second one is in regards to the concern I have that the longer this trade war with China lasts, the more market share we start losing in China. China pivots to other countries, and how difficult it's going to be to regain that market share, because back home in my district in Wisconsin, my family farmers are getting hammered, and manufacturers. We had record bankruptcies for family farms last year alone, with close to, well over 800. That trend is continuing. I'm not saying this trade war is the sole cause, but it certainly is piling on right now. So those are the two questions I'll ask you. But before I do that, I think it's safe to assume, and you've probably heard it from most members, that there's bipartisan consensus on the challenges that we face with China. You know, the IP theft, forced technology transfers, forced joint ventures, what you're trying to accomplish in these negotiations. And there's bipartisan agreement on where we need to go and how we need to resolve this. But there is a difference of opinion on the tactics being used. There was another approach through a multilateral effort. I still believe that our summarily rejecting the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement is going to go down as one of the great strategic mistakes we made in the 21st century. This president, this administration summarily rejected it without due consideration. 12 nations in the largest and fastest growing economic region in the world, the Pacific Rim area, came up with standards and rules that elevate up to where we are. That China would have been on the outside looking in, would have isolated them and put great pressure on them, whether it was prohibition on IP theft, on forced technology transfers, on joint ventures, strong labor and environmental chapters, fully enforceable, e-commerce and digital trade chapter, everything that we're trying to accomplish right now to elevate standards to where we are. A prohibition against localization rules, for instance, was contained in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Moving forward on that would have put, I think, incredible leverage on China, isolating them in the region, and now we're on the outside looking in. And China's being able to help establish those rules of trade. At some point, we hope to be able to find a way to get back in that agreement rather than disadvantaging us from that. But having said that, let me go back to the original questions I asked in regards to the level of cooperation and coordination with other nations right now in regards to China. There's strength in numbers. And I think ultimately China will respond to the collective will of the international community much better than the unilateral action that we're taking against them today. And then finally, the lost market access issue.
So, thank you, Congressman. I would say, first of all, I think getting out of TPP was the right decision. It was a bad agreement. It was poorly negotiated, and a car could have been manufactured 45% in Vietnam and 55% in China and sold in the United States duty-free. It didn't do much on currency, had a whole lot of problems, and in any event, to get to your geopolitical problem, had China joined it, they wouldn't have lived up to the rules, we would have had a problem. Number one. Number two, as you know well, we have FTAs with 6 of the 11 countries that are in it already, and of the other 5, 95% of the GDP is in Japan, where, with your support and help, we're negotiating. So now I've said my thing, but I said it like this period of time. In terms of cooperation, we are trying to do it on 2 tracks. We do want to cooperate with other countries. As I say, we have the trilateral thing. We're trying your approach. I would say, though, that your approach by itself was less likely to be successful, and indeed was tried by prior administrations unsuccessfully. So what we want to do is continue that approach, but also put in place the unilateral action that the President has taken. And I would note that that unilateral action is what has brought us to the point where we are now. We're hopefully on the verge of beginning to turn the corner. In terms of
the gentleman will finish.
Well, in terms of trade with China, we hope that we can get these barriers down, and we can do this before we lose our supply chains and our customers.
Okay. Thank you. Let me recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Dr. Winstrup, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here with us today. Question a little off track from China, but does relate to China. My colleague, Terry Sewell, and I have introduced the legislation to extend the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act for another 10 years from 2020 to 2030. It's an important program to U.S. textile industry because it requires the use of U.S.-made yarns. And for a country like Haiti, this act allows their garment industry a fighting chance to compete with large Asian suppliers such as China and Vietnam. And with the program set to expire and people trying to make investment decisions and production plans, certainty is important to U.S. companies, but especially when doing business in a least developed country like Haiti. Do you foresee support for a reauthorization of this act?
I'm not prepared to say. I haven't studied it. I don't have an idea. The fact that you and Congresswoman Sewell are in favor of it certainly is a very positive indicator from my point of view. But I want to look at it, and I would also say that generally the requirements of U.S.-made yarn in textiles going forward is something that I have supported as a matter of policy in a variety of other areas. But I want to look at that so I can give you an informed opinion.
So it hasn't come up in any talks with China and how it might affect them. So
pardon me? It
hasn't come up in any conversations with China as how it might affect them, that they have a concern about it.
No, that specifically it has not.
One other question when it comes to China's retaliation, if you will, and some of the effects on agriculture and their access to markets. You talk about some of the non-tariff barriers, and one of the things that's come to attention is inspection requirements that aren't scientific based. Can you elaborate on some of the things that they're doing in that arena, if you will?
I'd be happy to do that, Congressman. This is something that we spent an awful lot of time on. There's a whole lot of, as you know, technical barriers to trade or non-tariff barriers to trade, depending on what term you want to use. One of them that we spent probably the most single time on, this whole issue of biotechnology and their approval processes. In the U.S., it's 18 to 24 months to get an approval. In China, there are ones that are 7 and 8 years and haven't had approval. It's a very complicated process, and it is one where that has a very, very negative effect on the United States, because in many cases, U.S. farmers will not introduce the technology themselves in the U.S. until it's approved in their major markets, one of which is China. So we spent a lot of time on that. Hopefully, we made some headway. The time was both to change things systemically and to put in time limits and the like. Whether we succeed on that, we'll see. I don't want to suggest that we will, but we did raise it and talk about it a great deal, that there be science-based decision-making, because right now there's not science-based decision-making in many, many cases. That there be time, and we have a long pipeline of things that have been stacked up for years and years and years and years and years. So we understand how important this is. They're changing their process and getting it really more in line with the international norms is something we spend a lot of time about, and have it be science-based. So we'll see where that turns out. I don't want to suggest that those talks are over. We spent a lot of time on it, though, and we realize how important it is.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from New Jersey to inquire, Mr. Pasquale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, fulfilling Article 1, Section 8. Very clear that the Congress has a major role, the major role under Article 1 in trade negotiations, and I thank you for appearing before us. China needs to provide, we agree, greater access for U.S. services firms and allowing the ability to invest and operate independently from state-owned enterprises and competitively in the financial services, technology, and audiovisual sectors. Beyond the scope of the 301 report, I want to ask you about two things quickly. One, it has been reported that there will be a memorandum of agreement on currency in this deal. I've read your comments from the 2010 U.S.-China Security and Economic Commission, in which you laid out your standards for combating currency manipulation. You laid them out very clearly. You argued in that presentation that China's practice of currency manipulation, because it constitutes a countervaluable subsidy under our CVD law. I agree. I have a bill that would treat it as such. You argued we should be, quote unquote, imaginative in dealing with this issue, including restricting imports or even requesting compensation for value of lost market access. Do the terms you have reached with China on currency live up to your own standards on currency? Mr. Ambassador, make it as short as possible. Thank you.
I'm not very good at that. But
none of us are.
I would say, first of all, I think without question the President has been imaginative, right? The whole 301 approach we've used has been something that people haven't used before, and it's had a huge difference. So I feel very comfortable that I've passed my own standard of imaginative. And I might say, in the case of the President, gritty, right? He had the grit to get this done. In terms of currency, it is certainly our objective, and once again, these provisions are never agreed to, everything's agreed to, that there be commitments not to do competitive devaluations. As Congressman, I think it was Thompson said, it's complicated what's happened in the last couple of years, where we are on that, and I could argue that round, or I could argue it square. Those kind of decisions on currency manipulation are not made by me, of course, they're made by the Secretary of Treasury, but they're complicated issues. But without question, in the past, China has used currency manipulation, and our desire is that there be commitments like that, as well as commitments to a certain amount of transparency.
I hope for another meeting, Ambassador, we will talk about the relationship between your job and the Treasurer's job in terms of trade, and where exactly does the Congress fit in? Do you think labor or environmental issues are in the scope of the 301 negotiations?
I would say to the extent that they are involved in these unfair trade practices, they are. But this is not like a free trade agreement where we're going across the board and looking at a whole variety of very important issues. So my scope is narrower here because it's based on 301. And by the way, I would love to work with you and other members who want to sit back and figure out a way that we can create new statutory authority that allows me to use something like 301 in these areas. I would love to sit down and talk to you.
Mr. Chairman, can I just add one sentence?
Please.
If your answer, if not, to my question, I'd point out the agricultural market access is not in the scope of the 301 report, but you are negotiating these anyway. And so, you know, consistency, I'm not really, that's not the essence of my question, my point, which my time is up. But I wanted you to take a look at that because it's caused some confusion, and I would like some clarity on it. If at all possible, call me, write me, whatever you can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, for joining us today. You know, as the representative of the air capital of the world and the breadbasket of America, trade's a critical issue for my district and for the state of Kansas. In fact, according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, trade supports over 108,000 jobs for these exports, and the value over $17 billion for the economy in our state. Before I focus on trade relationships with China, I want to first thank you for your work on upgrading NAFTA and replacing it with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. You know, Canada and Mexico are Kansas' top export markets, worth about $3.5 billion. And since its adoption, NAFTA has been really beneficial for my district, particularly the farmers, ranchers, and aerospace manufacturers. But the 20-year-old agreement did need some upgrading and some reform efforts, and I'm thankful for that they've done that, and hopefully that we can get through this process and get that ratified quickly so that we can move forward with some of the other important issues that you're doing. So let's go back today and focus, as we want to, on China. You know, tariff retaliation from China has threatened Kansas exports worth about $525 million to China, led by a lot of grain products, soybeans, sorghum, cotton, beef, as well as aircraft manufacturing and other manufacturing. As a big supporter of free and fair trade, I believe a prolonged trade war with these tariffs is not the final outcome that any of us want. You know, as I've talked to Kansas farmers and manufacturers in the district, I've heard over and over again how they support the president and believe we can get a better trade deal negotiating through strength. One of the things I think our colleagues on both sides of the aisle would agree that China has been harming American businesses and workers for decades. In fact, we've seen so much cheating over the years that it's having a drastic impact. You know, for example, in 2013, a Chinese national was arrested in Kansas for attempting to steal some intellectual property regarding research pertaining to rice seeds and to send that to scientists in China. So I'm proud that President Trump's been one of the first presidents to stand up to these unfair trade practices and hope to bring China to the table in a meaningful way to help make sure we have free and fair trade agreements. Since we've entered this negotiations with China, there's been a lot of positive steps, and we want to make sure that we continue moving forward with some of those positive activities. I don't want to stop there. You know, as I mentioned earlier, that China has threatened exports from Kansas worth $525 million. And one of the things we want to make sure that, you know, as I talk with constituents, that particularly with both in the farming community as well as aerospace, and hopefully that we can work on making sure that the retaliatory and regulatory practices are fixed. And so I just want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in that regards on your negotiation of correcting those unfair practices.
Well, you know, thank you very much, Congressman, and thank you specifically for your support on USMCA. As you know, that's our top priority, and if if the Congress doesn't see fit to pass that, then everything else we're talking about is kind of like a footnote, because it'll mean we can't do trade deals and we can't, we're not going to be in the trade space. I mean, it's just, it would be such an admission of failure by all of us. So I'm very grateful for your support in that area. I would also note that we talk about manufacturing jobs being lost because of Chinese practices. The reality is that farmers have been hurt as much as anyone by their practices. That's a huge market. They're our second or third biggest agricultural market if you skip over 18 and go back to 17 and traditional years. But the reality is they should be buying much, much more agricultural products. And my hope is that these purchases as part of this, while not central, will lead to that, will lead to new markets that will go on for years and years and years.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, to inquire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Ambassador, thank you. I thank you for the work you've done and the work you are doing, and for the candor in responding to inquiries and questions. I represent an area in Chicago known as Chinatown, and I'm trying to figure out what it is that I say to the Chinese American Chamber of Commerce there when I go and meet with them. And so I'd like to know as specifically as I could, when it comes to disregard for intellectual properties protection, currency manipulation, and market access for U.S. businesses that are trying to do business in China, given the fact that it is an enormous market. What can I say and tell the Chamber of Commerce in Chinatown that I'm doing, or we're doing, or you're doing?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. I would say this, first of all. Chinese Americans and many Chinese businessmen themselves, but Chinese American businessmen universally have said to the President and to me for the President, hang tough. This is really, really, really important. We have to do things that lead to reform in China. We are not forcing reform in China. We are working with reformers in China who want to reform China. And nobody knows better how important that is than Chinese American business people, men and women. They absolutely know what the problem is. And they realize also what the potential is if China takes a step forward and changes these practices, the potential for them and really the potential for us, but also I would say the potential for China is enormous. And that's why, in fact, China has reformers, and that's why it has people who want to change some of these policies. The reality is that all of our businesses, and their group probably more than any, are afraid to do business at some tier. They're afraid to do business with China because they will lose not only what we think of as technology, but also know-how, just how they do business, that they will not have their intellectual property protected and respected, and that there are huge markets that they could open up if we get this kind of thing reformed. But I would be really interested the next time you go back and do that and talk to them, if you call me and tell me, and I'll come up and talk to you, because I'd be very interested to know what their reaction is to what we're doing. I find these people follow this stuff really a lot closer than most Americans do. And when I talk to them, they're like, hang tough. Don't go for as many congressmen of your colleagues, don't go for the soybean solution. Go for the structural change. This is our one chance. I'd be really interested to get your feedback after you talk to these men and women.
We'll make sure we do that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize Mr. Schweikert to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, let's face it, some of the best questions have already been asked, so I actually have a one-off. How do we future-proof? Let's say you have amazing success. The angels sing, whatever happens. What do we do to future-proof a success. Is it time that those of us here in Congress have a serious discussion on streamlining the WTO? Its level of being almost ineffectual. You know, the number of filings that, you know, when we read through them, we're a decade later and a tweak has been made and the bad acts are still happening. What do we do so we're not back having the same discussion a year, 2 years, 3 years from now?
Okay, well, thank you, Congressman. I want you to know that after the number of hearings that I've done before the committee, whenever I think of the future, I think of you. If you're always going to ask me a question about that, I should be thinking more about the future. So
it's either a good thing or an annoying thing.
Well, it's a good thing, in my opinion. It's, we all have a tendency to think about the here and now probably more than we should. So thinking about going off into the future is something that's important. I would say, number one, realistically, having a real enforcement process. That enforcement process is going to, as you resolve issues, if you're doing it properly, you're going to be resolving issues in ways that turn up new problems and new trends. And I think you have to be able to deal with it in that process. And as I've tried to say, I'm not Pollyanna.